4, and in this video, I'd like to walk through chapter 6 of book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This chapter here, chapter 6 of book 1, is a chapter that students often run into after enjoying the first 5 chapters because they're pretty simple to get through. But in chapter 6, we run into a wall because Aristotle gets into some philosophical discussion that most students just can't comprehend. They don't understand what he's talking about, and that's not their fault. It's just because Aristotle, remember, was a Platonist before he developed his own philosophical doctrines. And so he talks about Platonism in a very comfortable way, and most students just don't know it. And as I posted recently a talk titled "There's no need to study Plato." There is no need to study Plato, and I wouldn't want to tell the students, well, you need to study Plato so that you can understand chapter 6 of Aristotle's Ethics, especially when Aristotle's talking about Plato in this chapter because Plato's wrong. So once again, usually from Aristotle on into Thomas Aquinas, when Plato's mentioned, it's usually because he's wrong about something. So what I'd like to do here, and this may be a longer video because this is a fairly long reading in the Ethics, but I'd like to go through it nice and slow and carefully, and in one video explain for students what Aristotle's talking about here in chapter 6 of book 1. And I don't intend for this to provide any sort of mastery of the doctrines of Plato, because again, they're not important for us. But I'd like students to at least be comfortable knowing that they've read through chapter 6 and not feel like they're cheating and just sort of skipping it to get to the next chapters, which get much simpler. So it's just this one chapter that's difficult as we get started in ethics. And sometimes this chapter can be like a fence that students who don't ask for help and who don't work hard just never get past. So I'd like to try to make that no longer the case. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll get started here. We're going to read through the text, and then I'll just do my best to explain every piece that we come across so you can have a clear sense of what chapter 6 is talking about. I looked at the commentary of St. Thomas on this chapter, and to be frank, I think he makes it more complicated than it is. He breaks this single chapter. He takes 3 lectures to talk about this chapter, and I really think he talks too much in explaining the content here, because I really don't think it's that complicated, and I'm going to sort of bring it down to just one lesson that I think the kids will appreciate. So let's take a look at the text, and then we'll get going here. All right. So this is the text that's on the Academy website. I've taken some time to just go through it and clean up formatting a little bit, because sometimes formatting can help the reader to understand the text. So there are some places where I think formatting is all that a student needs to have just a little bit of help to understand and see more clearly what the chapter is about. And I've also, especially further down, you'll see these little these little numbers here. I've added some embedded notes. And again, this is just to make this a little easier for students to understand. And I think that if you watch this video and hear what I have to say to explain these things, then you can just look at these brief little notes, and it should be enough to help you remember the content and the ideas and get through it. You can see there's just a few of these notes. So I think that's all the kids will need to make it through this lesson with understanding, but I'd like to read through it and explain it in this video. And you can see it's for a chapter in Aristotle, it's pretty long, so this might take us some time. I'll try to be as brief as possible, okay? Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 6. And just a quick context before we get started. Aristotle introduced the study of ethics, explained why it's valuable, because we'd like to know what the chief end of human life is, so we can aim at it like an archer aiming at a target. We'll be much more likely to obtain the end of life if we actually know what it is, rather than just grope around in the darkness trying to figure out what we should do all the time. So the goal of ethics is to understand the end of man so we can aim our lives at it and align everything at that target and then pursue it. And we're going to talk about what that end is. I might have talked about it already. I don't remember, but it's happiness or felicity. That's the end of the human life. Man was made to be happy forever. So happiness is that end. And we talked about the problem with naming happiness as the end of the human life. The problem is that people disagree on what happiness is. Some people think that you can have happiness without virtue. Other people know that you can only pursue happiness by means of virtue. And so we've got these different kinds of lives that develop among men. Some men seek pleasure and consider that they're going to find happiness in their pleasure. Some men seek honor and consider honor to be the source of happiness. And then others seek wisdom and understand wisdom and virtue to be the means to happiness. And then we get to chapter 6, and Aristotle sort of takes a side road and gets us into what is really a big waste of time. This chapter, he goes into the detail a little, to some degree, of Plato's teaching on what it means for something to be good. And he goes through this complicated explanation of Plato's doctrine and refutes some points of Plato's doctrine, all to say at the end, it doesn't matter because Plato was wrong about this. And then we bounce back to the topic where we left off in chapter 7. So just for the sake of completeness, I get upset about that as a student. When I study a book, I want to understand every chapter. I don't want to be told, you can just skip that chapter. So for the sake of the most zealous students who are stubborn like me, I'd like to go through this and make sure it's clear. All right. So with that context laid out, let's get to chapter 6 here. Aristotle says, perhaps, however, it's better to consider universal good, and inquire how it is said to subsist, though such an inquiry as this will be arduous, because the men who have introduced ideas are our friends. So Aristotle says, is there some universal thing called good? And I should probably put that in quotation marks. Is there something like the absolute good, the good that is outside of all other things, which causes us to call other things good? Is there such a thing as the universal or absolute good? Does such a thing exist? Because in Platonic thinking, you would expect that to exist, because Plato always has these abstracted ideas, which are sort of the perfect forms of different things. You would think that for the good, Plato would have this abstracted idea of the universal good from which all things receive their goodness, right? We look at something and say that's good because it participates in this universal idea of goodness. That seems like a very Platonic idea. So Aristotle says, let's think about this and see whether that actually makes any sense, whether there is some universal or perfect good that gives the essence of good things, by allowing them to share in the essence of this idea of the universal good. He says this is going to be a difficult study for a number of reasons. One is because ethics is not the appropriate place to investigate this topic of the universal good. He's going to talk about that, so I won't say any more. And also he says, because the men who have introduced ideas are our friends. So it's going to be difficult morally, because Aristotle says, look, the guys who hold these ideas are my friends. I love them. I'm supposed to be loyal to them. I don't want to say anything negative against them. I have a moral duty to respect and love and honor my friends. And so I have to be careful because this is going to be difficult because I've got to make a choice. And it's a difficult choice to make because of my moral duty to my friends. Now, this is a Greek idea that most of us, Christians, at least in our idle talk, most of us would have a difficult time with. Now, this is seen in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, where we talk about the idea of piety. There's a man who witnessed his father cause the death of another man, a servant. And this son decides that he's going to bring his father to court and publicly accuse him of murder. And this man runs into Socrates along the way, and Socrates basically says, like, hey, what's up? What are you doing? And this guy says, I'm going to court. And Socrates says, oh man, what happened? He said, I'm going to prosecute someone for murder. And Socrates says, oh my goodness, who could it be? Who is who is being prosecuted here? And Euthyphro says, my dad. I'm taking my dad to court to prosecute him for murder. And Socrates goes nuts because in piety, you would never do something like that. Even if it was true, it's just not proper for a son to do that to his father. And so they had an idea of certain virtues, sort of like a social etiquette, that even for the sake of truth, some things come first, like a blood is thicker than water kind of etiquette. And so Socrates is like, whoa, 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 you can't prosecute your father. That's immoral. That's impious. That's prideful and offensive to the gods. And so there's a Greek system of etiquette or morals that's very different from modern society. And that's what Aristotle's referring to here with respect to friendship. Friendship was considered a bond that you die for. You lay down your life for your friends. You take the rap for your friends, as it were. And so Aristotle's saying, we've come to this topic, and it's kind of uncomfortable for me because this is Plato's idea, and I really don't want to dishonor my friend, but I've got to make a choice between Plato and the truth. And unfortunately, they're not on the same side on this issue, and I'm going to have to go with truth. So we just see Aristotle's moral carefulness as he thinks about, arguing against Plato while making sure to retain the respect that's due to a friend, which is pretty impressive when we're studying moral philosophy here. So in the second paragraph, he says, it may perhaps seem to be better, indeed necessary to the salvation of truth, to rescue the truth. Think of truth as like a hostage that's been taken and is tied up and stuck in the basement. He's basically using this illustration to say, truth has been taken hostage by Plato's teaching, and I've got to sort of try to sneak into the house and set truth free. It's necessary for the salvation of truth to subvert the opinions even of our friends. For both being our friends, that is Plato and the truth, it is holy, it is pious. See that idea of that Greek virtue of piety. It is pious to give preference to truth. So you should choose truth over a friend, he says. So I don't think I'm acting immorally. I think that it's my obligation, my moral duty to argue for the truth here. And I don't mean any offense to my friend Plato. Moving on. Those, however, who have introduced this opinion, this idea of a universal good that exists sort of above and outside all things, a universal good, they do not make ideas of things in which they admit there are the prior and posterior. Now, you can see how this language becomes very philosophical, very Platonic, and that's what the kids normally struggle with. So if you're reading this, I hope you've read this on your own before watching this video, but if you read this, you'll just feel yourself get bogged down and overwhelmed by this philosophical talk. But it's because Aristotle's talking about something that for his audience, back in the 4th century before Christ, they would be familiar with these ideas. These are Plato's ideas. This is This is the philosophy they've all studied. But for us, it's quite foreign. Those, that is Plato and his followers, who have introduced this opinion of this universal idea of good, they don't make ideas, and again, this is the Platonic notion of idea, like the perfect form of something. They don't make ideas of things in which they admit that there are prior and posterior. They do not establish an idea, for example, of numbers. They don't have an idea of sort of the perfect idea of number. That doesn't make any sense because there's prior and posterior. But good, and I put it in quotes there so we'd emphasize it as you read it, but good is predicated of essence, and essence, remember, is just another name for substance. Good is predicated of substance, but also of quality and relation. That, however, which has subsistence in and of itself per se, and essence, are prior to that which subsists as a relative or as an attribute. For this, that is, a relative, resembles the branch of a tree and an accident of being. An accident is some sort of attribute or quality. So there will not be a common idea in these things because there is prior and posterior, because the substance is prior to the accidents. The accidents are predicated of a substance. The substance can exist by itself, but the accidents can only exist in the substance. So he says these have a certain relationship. They have a relationship as prior and posterior. So I can say that some substance is good. I can predicate good of a substance. But I can also say that some quality is good. I can predicate good of a quality. I can predicate good of a relation. So I can predicate good of things that are prior and posterior. And the Platonists, Aristotle says, well, they don't make ideas concerning things that can be prior and posterior. And so technically, they shouldn't accept an idea of the good because the good can be predicated of things that do admit prior and posterior. And so he explains that really based on their own teaching and based on the way that the word good is used, good shouldn't be accepted as one of these ideas, this idea of an absolute separated good. Okay, so he says, this is his first argument. He says, this is one reason why really it doesn't make any sense for Platonists to believe that there is some abstract absolute good. Okay, that's the first argument he makes. Then he goes on and makes a second argument, again, which is like saying, secondly, again, the good, in quotes there, is predicated in as many ways as being. For it is predicated in essence, as God and intellect, which are essences, and they are said to be good. But it is also predicated in quality, as the virtues. It is predicated in quantity, as the moderate. The moderate is said to be good. In relation, as utility, usefulness is said to be good. In time, as occasion or opportune, like a good time for something, right? This is a good time to take a break, or this is a good time to take a nap. We say time is good because it's opportune or it's a proper occasion for something. And in a place, we also say that a certain place is good. And after the same manner in the other predicaments or the other categories. It is evident, therefore, that there will not be some certain common, universal, and one good, for it would not be predicated in all the categories. If there was this one universal good, it would not be predicated in all the different categories, but only in one category. Okay, so this is a second argument against the idea of some universal good existing as the Platonists taught. Then when he says farther still, this is a third argument. Farther still, since of things which subsist according to one idea, there is also one science. So if we've got a class of things that all belong to one one idea in this Platonic system, if there's a class of things all united under one idea, there will be one science, one system of knowledge which serves that one idea. Since of things which subsist according to one idea, there is also one science. Of all goods, there would be one certain science. But there are many sciences of things which are under one category. Thus, for instance, with occasion or opportune time, the art of commanding an army is conversant in war. But the medical art is conversant in disease. That's the occasion for the art. War is the occasion for commanding an army. Good time. Disease is the occasion for the use of the medical art. It's the right time, the good time for to call in the doctor. And with the moderate, indeed, the medical art is conversant in food, but the gymnastic art is conversant in labor. So we can see that there's different uses of the term good in all these different ways. It may, however, be doubted what their intention is, their meaning the Platonists. It may be doubted or questioned what their intention is in denominating or naming any idea itself, since in man, that is man itself, man as a species, in man and in a man, an individual man, if I point and say that is a man, there's really one and the same definition of man. So we've got this idea of man himself, but then we also use the name man to name an individual, and yet those two words, they have the same meaning. So why even think that they're two different things when they've got the same meaning? There's no difference between them. But if this be the case, in the same way, neither so far as good will good itself, that is the absolute good, neither will good itself and good things differ. Nor will it be in a greater degree good, because it's eternal, that is the absolute good. We can't say, well, it's more good, it's gooder, because the idea, the absolute good, lasts forever, because something is not called good because it's so for longer. A quality is not said to be of something because it's of such a quality for a longer time. He says we can't nor will it be in a greater degree good by being eternal, since neither is that which is white for a long time more white than that which is white for only one day. We don't use quality in that sense. So how would they be different? How would this absolute idea even be different? And this is again another reason why he believes that we can't accept the idea of some absolute good, some idea of perfect good. And he says, on this point, I think that the Pythagoreans, which was a school of philosophers that came before Plato, he says the Pythagoreans appear to speak more probably or more reasonably concerning the good, because they place the one in the coordination of things good, whom Speusippus also seems to have followed. Speusippus was a Platonist. He seems to have followed the Pythagoreans on this issue. And you can say, well, what is that talking about? Well, now you're getting into Pythagorean philosophy, okay? He says they placed the one in the coordination of things good. So Pythagoras listed different kinds of things that might all be called good, and one of the things he listed was one. One is a good thing, and multitude is a bad thing. Kind of a strange way. It's a different philosophy, so you'd have to get into that philosophy to actually understand all those concepts. But Aristotle says, comparing Plato's idea of the absolute good and Pythagoras' idea of the good, if I was to pick one of them, I would go with Pythagoras, because I think his explanation is better than Plato's. But then he says this, he says, but the discussion of these things pertains to another treatise. In other words, we have to stop here because this is metaphysics we're talking about. All right. This is an ethics class. We're here to study ethics together. We're getting into all of this talk about the absolute good and what is good itself and things like that. And he's like, this is not proper for a study of ethics. This is for metaphysics. So let's just save that for when we study metaphysics. Let's save that for another treatise. All right. That's why I said we get into this discussion on the universal good. We work hard to understand all this. We read it and reread it and figure it out. And then we get to the end and there's this big letdown because Aristotle says, that's enough of that. It doesn't matter. This is for metaphysics. Okay. So again, I want students to understand this just so they have a sense that they're moving chapter by chapter and they get what Aristotle's talking about. But at the same time, I want students to see that their struggle with this, part of the reason why they're struggling is because this question actually doesn't belong in ethics. This is actually a metaphysical question to be dealt with in a different way, in a different treatise, in a completely different science. All right? And Aristotle wrote a whole separate treatise on metaphysics. Okay? So let's keep going here. I think we're doing pretty good so far. A certain doubt, however, presents itself concerning the particulars we have just mentioned, because reasons are not assigned concerning every good, but things which are of themselves the objects of our pursuit and love. Now, if you remember the first 5 chapters of ethics, you can feel that Aristotle is sort of moving us away from that metaphysical stuff, talking about absolute good and things, and he's bringing us back to the language of the study of ethics here. He says, reasons are not assigned concerning every good, but things which are of themselves the objects or the ends of pursuit and love are predicated according to one species. And those things which are effective of these, or in a certain respect preserve them or impede their contraries, are predicated on account of these and after another manner. Now, that's complicated language as Aristotle commonly uses. And as a student, you've got to learn to just park yourself on these sentences and read them and read them and read them until your mind starts to comprehend all of the ideas that are shared in them. All right? So Aristotle's trying to nail down what exactly we mean by good. And he says, well, it looks like there's 2 different kinds of good, really. There's 2 different species of good. There are some things that are called good that we desire for their own sake. We desire them as ends in themselves, like wisdom. Wisdom is something that we pursue, not necessarily to get something else, but because we simply want to be wise. We want to possess wisdom. Wisdom is an end in itself. It's good in a certain way as an end in itself. But there are other things, he says, other things which are effective of these, which help us to obtain those things good for their own sake. So there's a different kind of good. There's another kind of good that we use or we seek them not for their own sake, but we seek them to get these other things, which is what we really are after. And these things are referred to as things that are useful. Okay, they're the first group of things we would say that they are truly good. They're the good things. And then this second group of things, what we mean by good is useful, right? They're useful because they can help us to get those better things. So he's identifying these two different species of the good. He then says in this last sentence in this paragraph, it is evident, therefore, that good may be predicated in 2 different ways. Some things are good per se, that is, they're good in and of themselves. We seek them for their own sake. Some things are good per se, but others are good on account of these. Others are useful. Others are good for the sake of getting these things that are good per se. All right. So even though that language in that paragraph there, the paragraph that begins with a certain doubt, even though that paragraph is a difficult read, the concept in that paragraph is actually pretty simple. He's simply saying, I've noticed that it seems that there are two species of good. There is one that's good per se, good in and of itself, and then there's another that's good on account of those things which are good per se. Pretty simple paragraph, but the wording, as Aristotle normally does. And remember, this is an English translation, so we're one step away from the original language, even though Taylor does a great job translating the ideas for us. The reading is difficult for that paragraph, but the concept in it is actually pretty simple. Okay, so we have two species, two different kinds of good things. Let's keep going. Separating, therefore, good things per se from good things useful. You should understand what the distinction is now, right? Good things per se, good things that are sought for themselves, and good things and things useful, things that are sought for the sake of those other things, these two species. Let us consider whether they are predicated according to one idea. What kind of goods can be said to be good per se? What kind of goods might we say are good in and of themselves, are desired for their own sake? What kind of goods? Are they such as are pursued alone, apart from other things, such as to be wise, or to see, and some pleasures and honors? For these, though we pursue them on account of something else, yet at the same time they may be ranked by some one among goods which are good per se. Or is the good per se nothing else except idea, that is, the absolute good? Is the good in and of itself this idea of absolute good? Form, and again, this is Platonic language, right? Form or idea will be vain. It'll be useless. What will be the point of a separate good? If the good is that which we seek, Aristotle's saying, if the good is that which we desire, that which we work for, that which we trade for, that which we desire and seek, what would be the point of some abstract idea of good? How would that actually be good for anyone? Right? He says it would just be vain, this form or idea of good. But if these also rank among goods which are good per se, it will be requisite that the same definition of the good should be conspicuous in all of them, just as there is the same definition of whiteness in snow, and this word here means white lead. If you look it up, it's a white kind of metal. So whether we're talking about snow or we're talking about metal, white means the same thing. We don't say that's white snow and mean one thing and then say this is white metal and means something different. It's not blue, right? White, even though the things are different, white is predicated of each of them in exactly the same way. But of honor and prudence and pleasure, there will be other and different definitions, so far as they are good things. The good, therefore, is not something common according to one idea. In what manner, however, is it said that there is one idea of the good? So he's asking, like I don't understand what Plato means, because we don't use the word good in just one way, as if there's one absolute good. And when I say that this is good and that is good and that is good, I don't mean it in the same way. I mean it in different ways. There are different meanings. The word good is used multifariously, to use a big word. It's used in different ways. And that causes us to say that there can't be some universal idea of good, because it just wouldn't work. It'd be useless. Okay? It does not resemble things which are, and then we've got this lovely phrase here, fortuitously homonymous. Now, you should know what homonymous means from the categories, if you're studying logic, as I hope you are. Fortuitously means accidentally, by chance. It does not resemble things which just happen to be homonymous. That is, they don't just happen to have the same name. Like they're called good for a reason. It's not just accidental. Is it because all good things are from one and are referred to one good? Is that why we call things good? We have this idea in our mind of the universal good, the good of all. And we see something, we say, ah, this seems to participate in the universal good. And oh, look at this over here. This appears to participate in the universal good. And oh, is this food healthy? Oh, it's good. We must be thinking of this idea of the universal good and just applying this universal idea to all these different things. He's like, that's not how we use the word good. We use it in all different kinds of ways, in all different circumstances and contexts. Is it because all good things are from one and are referred to one good? No, he says. Or is it rather according to analogy? Is it because we've got this idea of the universal good and we're like making this comparison? We're saying like, oh, this is like the good, right? Oh, look at this good boy. He is like the good, and that's why we call him good. And Aristotle's saying that's not how we use these words. We don't think that there's some kind of analogy between this thing and the universal good. That's not what we mean. As sight is to the body, he gives us an example. As sight is to the body, so is intellect in the soul. Are we saying that things are good because they all share this common relationship? And he's like, no, I don't think that is what we're saying when we use the word good. But then again, so we start to feel like we're making some progress in this study, feel pretty good about ourselves, and then Aristotle says, well, perhaps these things must be omitted at present. It's not the right time to talk about these things. Of course, he writes this whole long chapter only to say, it's really not very helpful for us to get into these things. Perhaps these things must be omitted at present for the accurate discussion of them, not this loose, goofy discussion we're currently engaged in that's wasting all of your time. The accurate discussion of them will be better adapted to another philosophy, which you should know now to be metaphysics. And in a similar manner concerning idea, and I should probably put idea in quotation marks there to remind you that it's this Platonic notion of idea. For even if there is some one good, even if there is some one good which is predicated in common of all things, or which is something itself separate by itself, it is evident that it can neither be practicable, it's not something we can do, it's not something that man can produce. This abstract good, remember he said it was vain, like okay, there's this abstract good, so we're talking about ethics here. We want to know about how to live well, how to be good men. What is this universal idea of good do for us? Is it something we can practice? Is it something we can do? Something we can produce? No, it's useless. All right. It's not something practicable. It's not something we can acquire or go and obtain somehow. It's just this abstract idea of the good. And he says, but now, that is in the study of ethics, which is our concern here, that which is practicable by man, which he may actually obtain, that's the object of our investigation. So the idea of a universal good, Aristotle says, it wouldn't even help us. It wouldn't even help us in ethics to hold this universal idea because it wouldn't be something we can do. It wouldn't be something that we can go get. And therefore, as far as moral philosophy is concerned, it's pretty useless. Perhaps, however, and this is the last paragraph, perhaps, however, the knowledge of this separate good may to someone appear to be better with respect to those goods which may be acquired. Maybe he would say, oh, this separate good, oh, this is the eternal good. This is better than all of the things that we can pursue here. All the things we can acquire can't be compared to the universal good. Maybe someone would say that. Maybe someone would say it's better than those goods which may be acquired and which are practicable. And for having this as a pattern or an exemplar is actually the word that Taylor used in the translation, exemplar, but I changed it to pattern because I don't think many people know what the word exemplar means. For having this idea of the universal good as a pattern or as a standard, we may in a greater degree know those things which are good for us. And by knowing this universal idea, we may more easily obtain them. This assertion, therefore, has judged a certain probability. It's okay, it's reasonable, but it seems to be dissonant or out of harmony with the sciences. For all the sciences aspire after a certain good, and they investigate that which is wanting, omitting the knowledge of it. Though it is not reasonable to suppose that all artists are ignorant of and do not search for an aid of such great importance. Aristotle's asking, like, when artists are working and designing things, like, is this how they think? Do they begin by thinking of the universal good, the idea of absolute goodness, and then sort of allow that to sprinkle down like fairy dust upon their works and products that they do? Is that how artists actually think? Aristotle's really saying, I don't think so. I don't think that's what artists are thinking about. He says, it's likewise dubious or doubtful what advantage a weaver or a carpenter would derive to their arts from the knowledge of the good itself, whatever that might be. How would that help a carpenter to have this idea of the universal good? How would that help a weaver? I don't think that's what weavers or carpenters are thinking about. Or how he who surveys the idea itself of the good will become more skilled in medicine or in commanding an army. So Aristotle's saying, I just don't think this is how anyone thinks of goodness or of the good. I don't think anyone starts with this universal idea of absolute goodness and then applies it to the work that they're doing. That's not how we think. We're really not that thoughtful. It's not how our arts and our works operate. He says, it appears that the physician does not think in this way concerning health. He does not consider health in this way. It's not how doctors think. But he considers the health of man. He doesn't consider health in a universal sense. He considers the health of man alone. Or perhaps even the health of one particular man. He may not even think of health with respect to mankind. He just thinks about the health of this one guy who walks into his office, or this one woman who's 6 months pregnant, or this one kid who got bit by a snake. He doesn't think about health. He thinks about the health of this individual person in these specific or particular circumstances. He restores health to an individual. That's how the physician thinks, Aristotle says. And so we come to the end of that paragraph, and then Aristotle closes the chapter, and thus much concerning these things. That's enough of that. All right? So that brings us to the end of chapter 6. Now, again, chapter 6 is a very difficult read. It's a very difficult chapter to read. And I can empathize with students who are working through it. Not only is it hard to read Aristotle sometimes, but it really stinks when you've got a chapter that's long, because you've got to do all of that work and read and reread and reread, and you've got to do it over an extended amount of content. So chapter 6 is always an obstacle for students, but I hope you can see that the ideas in chapter 6 are really not that complicated. It's just the language is very, very dense and simple. And there's lots of information between the lines, as it were, that needs to be understood, especially when Aristotle starts talking about Plato, whose ideas he just sort of takes for granted, like everybody knows this stuff. This is Plato's teaching. Well, for modern students, we don't know Plato's teaching. It takes quite a bit of work to understand Plato's teaching. But for Aristotle, where he was raised under Plato, those ideas were, normal. So anyway, I think that's a helpful walk through chapter 6. We've covered every line in the passage. There was nothing in there that I feel we've left uncertain, or sometimes you just sort of read through the line and skip it because you don't understand it. I don't think there's any line that we've done that with. I think we've covered all the content. I think we have a good sense of what Aristotle's saying here in chapter 6, that there's no reason for us to believe that there's some kind of universal good. But he says, just to qualify this, but we're going to consider this in metaphysics because it's not a totally crazy idea. It's just in ethics, this just is not what we mean by the good. This is really not what good means in the context of moral philosophy. So let's take that discussion of this abstract good, and let's just set that aside for now and save that for metaphysics. Let's get back to our concern here in ethics, which is good in terms of things that we can do or things that we can acquire for the sake of our chief end, which is happiness. All right. So I hope that that's a helpful walkthrough. I know that's helpful. I know what students struggle with, and I know that watching this video, reading through the text, maybe rewatching this video, rereading the text will give a good student a really clear sense of what Aristotle's talking about in chapter 6. And I think we got that done pretty quickly. How much time has it been? I don't see my timer. But I think we did pretty good getting through that. But anyway, that's all for chapter 6 of book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics. The bad news is you still have to study the chapter and complete the assessment. But the good news is that when we move into chapter 7 and beyond, one of the things that's cool about the study of ethics, which many lazy students never learn, is that it just gets easier and easier as you go. So these initial chapters, they can be a little tricky because Aristotle talks about some philosophical stuff in these early chapters, and lazy kids, they like to tap out and quit. But if you make it through, you keep working and get through these initial chapters. Once we get past, really even the next chapter starts to get more interesting and simple. We get out of this abstract philosophical talk away from Platonism, which can be annoying. And we get into Aristotle's really clear and useful, practical moral philosophy, which I think you'll enjoy. So just grind through this chapter on Aristotle's refutation of Plato's idea of absolute good. And I think you'll agree with me that next chapter is easier. And once we get a few more chapters in, I can just about promise you that this will be one of your favorite courses. It's one of the most helpful courses that you can study in any kind of subject area. All of my older kids, they might complain about studying Latin, or they might complain about geometry being boring and stuff like that. But my kids always have told me that studying Aristotle's Ethics changed their lives and helped them when they went into adulthood and had to make decisions. So I think you'll feel the same way. It's a great study. We just have to get through this initial philosophical stuff where Aristotle's really laying all the foundations, kind of clearing the weeds so that we can really get to work here and harvest the fruit of ethics, as it were. All right, so that's all for chapter 6 of book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics. If you have any questions, just post them on the support forums on the course page on the study center. You can post any questions you want on there. I mean, any questions, anything you read that's not clear, or you're just curious about, you've got a question, or you have some thought, you think you have some brilliant revelation about something, post it on the forum. It's good for us to communicate and chat as we study. I want you to use the forums in that way. And if there's something you'd like to ask or talk about that's a little more personal, you don't feel like talking about it on the forum, then you can send an email to mail@classicalliberalarts.com. That comes right to me, so you don't have to worry about 20 different people reading it. It's just going to come to me. Maybe my wife will see it, and if she sees it and sees it's about Aristotle, she's just going to ignore it, so don't worry about it. All right? So good luck with your studies. Keep working. These studies get easier and a lot more interesting. You just have to do this initial work to get through the hard stuff. All right. I hope that's helpful. God bless.